With over 800 Pokemon now, it's fascinating to study each and every design, all wildly different from one another. Pokemon have incorporated a wide variety of real-world biological, mythological, and even cultural influences, in an effort to create a diverse cast of lovable characters that also inhabit a fictional, but still believable ecosystem. Today I'm not interested in discussing individual designs and which are the best or the most popular, but rather generations as a whole, in an effort to determine which generation of Pokemon had the best designs. So a little preface before we get started. I'm going to be making a lot of generalizations here, because I'm going to be covering groups of Pokemon rather than individual designs. In this video, I'll be referring to batches of Pokemon by different descriptors, and that's not suggesting that literally every Pokemon in that generation falls in that category. There are always outliers, and literally every generation has a decent balance of Pokemon that are cute, monstrous, man-made, round, tall, and pretty much everything in between. And I think it's somewhat fair to generalize here. One specific generation could have the best Pokemon ever designed, but if the other 99 alongside are bad, then the generation can't take home the title. The second thing I want to note is that art is completely subjective. That's why it's so fun to discuss, because any great work of art will inspire a conversation, with vastly different opinions based on personal interpretation, so whatever generation comes out on top today will just be my opinion. So let's kick things off with the first generation of Pokemon. Now over 20 years old, these Pokemon set the template for what a Pokemon is and what a Pokemon could be. Quite literally, these were the first creatures ever designed in the franchise. So I think to this day, we point to these ones as a reference of what was fair game to design a Pokemon around. Let's take a look at them. Generally, Pokemon from Generation 1 were a lot more reptilian and rugged than what we have now. These creatures were often based on a whole amalgamation of different dinosaurs and animals to create a true RPG monster experience. Some Pokemon I have in mind for this generalization are Marowak, Nidoking, Machop, and Kangaskhan. These are good examples because they all look vaguely dinosaur-ic, with very subtle nods to Japanese and sometimes Chinese mythology in the case of Gyarados or Dragonair, but those are rare. And I'm not saying all the Pokemon here are vague monsters, because some of these ambiguous designs where it leans into many different animals are more cute in their design philosophy. For example, Pikachu, Eevee, and Clefairy are some of these cute but still ambiguous Pokemon that I think are the hallmark of Generation 1 designs. I believe their designs are directly responsible for making them arguably some of the franchise's most popular and iconic designs, so that's definitely a point in Generation 1's favor. On a more detailed level, it's interesting to note that the eyes in Generation 1 were less detailed and all had the generic dinosaur style, but that's because I don't think they knew how to design eyes quite yet, so they all kinda look the same. Because of the rugged dinosaur look and the whole angry eye thing, I think, with the exception of the Clefairy and the Jigglypuff lines, most fully evolved Pokemon in Kanto look generally tough, or at the very least regal. Or they were designed to fill a specific RPG niche based on traditional RPG monster types. For example, you have the Machop line as a humanoid reptilian, you have the Ghastly line as ghosts, and you have the Electrode line as mimics. None of these designs really draw from world culture or are specific to Kanto, and are really just basic designs. For example, Pidgey is just a bird to fit the need for an early game bird, and that's about it. With that in mind, let's move on to Generation 2. One glance at Generation 2 tells you the biggest generalization that you need to know. There's a lot of cute here. Overall, the designs are more cute, but that's because there is a huge abundance of small and baby-like Pokemon thanks to the introduction of breeding mechanics and cross-generation evolution. Also, thanks to the Game Boy Color and the popularity of the anime, the colors become more saturated and varied, as we expected Pokemon to move away from vague monsters and into something more marketable to kids of all ages and all genders. So to emphasize the cute factor, a lot of the Pokemon here ditch the angry dinosaur eyes and get a more simplistic expression. For example, we have Sudowoodo, Quagsire, and Phanpy that come to mind. Also with less rugged fur or horns, even the tough Pokemon have brighter colors and look a lot more cartoony. You could see design aspects like Ursaring's rings or Ampharos's face in all of its patterns to emphasize what I'm saying here. Because of this, a lot of the designs look a bit oversimplified and lack memorability for me and a lot of other folks. A lot of these are just kind of round and their expressions don't do much in their favor. To this day, Johto has a lot of filler for this design reason. I should also mention that there are some classic monster-style designs like Tyranitar, Heracross, and Steelix here, but that's simply due to the fact that these were designed concurrently with Generation 1, and they were left out simply for storage limitations. Because of this mix of extremely cute and simplified Pokemon and leftover monsters from Generation 1, I think there's a huge contrast here in terms of design. The highs are high, but the lows are low here, so it feels a lot more inconsistent than Generation 1, which was already kind of inconsistent. So we'll have to factor that into the final ranking when considering Johto. Here comes Generation 3, and with that, what many dub the Advanced Generation. The graphical limitations were far less of an issue here, and the Ruby and Sapphire games really felt like a soft reboot for the franchise in many ways. I would argue that the designs actually have a lot to do with that. That came later in the franchise, based on mythology, especially mythology that would fit the culture of the home region. The design philosophy changed here greatly. It leaned more into the deliberate, specific theming. Pokemon like Claydol, Aggron, Absol, and Mawile all have direct inspirations from Japanese and Chinese mythology. Also, there were a lot of object Pokemon that weren't expressly animals and were more deliberately executed, so they weren't just objects with eyes, the way they were back in Generation 1. So the Pokemon's inspirations come through clearly, but they also look like they inhabit the world well. Pretty much every design in Hoenn was also pretty vibrant, both in design geometry and saturation to match the extreme tropical climate of Hoenn. Pokemon like Wailord, Tropius, Ludicolo, and Camerupt all have excellent designs. They use a great mix of both rounded shapes reminiscent of Generation's 2 cuteness and the vague ruggedness of Generation 1, to promote a really good variety, with almost every Pokemon being memorable in some way. So Generation 3 is really where concept met execution. Onto Generation 4, I would say that this generation was more of a departure from Hoenn, in my opinion. It was a bit like Generation 1 in the fact that many designs channel the monster vibe once again, with rugged designs using less saturated color palettes despite the DS allowing for colors just as vibrant as the Game Boy Advanced. For example, Staraptor, Garchomp, Luxray, they're all very popular and they fit the monster role in terms of having an edge to their designs, so to speak. But unlike Generation 1's monsters, they're clearly based on one thing expressly, rather than an amalgamation of many things. For example, whereas Nidoking sort of looks like a rhino, but also has features of a gorilla, a rabbit, a dinosaur, and a bunch of other things, it's clear that here in Generation 4, Hippowdon is clearly based on a hippo and nothing else. Because of this heavy inspiration based off of only one clear thing, I would say that it hurts a lot of Pokemon. Pokemon like Gastrodon, Mothim, and Lumineon all have okay designs, but they look really boring, because they lack the high contrast shapes and colors from Generation 3, and they use more realistic proportions, so they look like forgettable real-world animals, rather than exciting Pokemon based on those animals. So in this way, Generation 4 kind of feels the same as Generation 1, where a lot of the Pokédex is just plain animals drawn in a somewhat cartoonish way, so that leaves room for very little that's exciting. But Generation 4 also had a lot of cross-generational evolutions, so it took Generation 1 and 2 standards and applied them to newer Pokemon, incorporating darker color palettes so they look like seamless transitions. They look like bigger, tougher, and often rounder versions of older Pokemon, enhancing their original designs. But I think that this is where Pokemon started to get roasted for being over-designed, with some of them having questionable and gratuitous details that makes it look like these guys don't really live in the wild. So overall, Generation 4 was another high contrast one like Generation 2. There's about 4 or 5 Pokemon that are universally praised here, but the rest seem very forgettable due to their over-realism like I mentioned before. So that hurts Generation 4. On to Generation 5, and where do I even begin with this one? Right off the bat, this was the most controversial generation, with designs like the Ice Cream and the Trash Pokemon as easy targets. This prompted many people to immediately write off this generation as the worst by far, but I think it's worth discussing. Firstly, in this generation, Pokemon became a lot less realistic and more cute than ever before. There were a lot of Pokemon that tried to be plain old animals just like Generation 1 in terms of concept, but the art design philosophy was way more exaggerated here, and it used way more exaggerated shapes than even Generation 3 did. It made the body proportions a lot less realistic. Brighter colors, less detailed fur, feet, and eyes that were a lot bigger were hallmarks of this generation. But I don't think it's always bad, because the eyes are generally more expressive than the dinosaur eyes of Generation 1 or the oversimplified expressions of Generation 2. This also brought into light the idea of accessories as natural elements of Pokemon, like the karate gis sported by both Throh and Sock, and the wooden steel pillars for Conkeldurr's evolution line. This reduces the idea of believability somewhat in my opinion. A lot of Generation 5 Pokemon were again based off of inanimate objects, but it was the inanimate object philosophy of Gen 1 more so than Gen 3. Because there were a lot of man-made Pokemon, but they weren't using it in the body design in an organic and believable way, and instead it reverted to the primitive philosophies of Generation 1, where it was literally just an object with a pair of eyes tacked on. I will say that Garbodor is actually exempt from this and is actually fairly organic looking and really well designed. So Generation 5 is another case of heavy polarization. There's a lot of excellent designs, because by this point Pokemon really nailed the monster design and how to base Pokemon on something real without making it too vague so it was ambiguous like Generation 1, but also not basing it on one thing too hard so it came off as boring and over-realistic like Gen 4 did. From this point on, I'm going to be talking vaguely about the following 3 generations as a whole, jumping back and forth, because I think the same design philosophy has persisted since Generation 6 and it hasn't really changed all too much. The biggest reason for this was just how thematic the regions got. Every region dating back to Generation 1 was based off of a real-world locale. But with Generation 6's Kalos, we got regions that were very heavily based off of the real-world locations. Like Unova is based off of New York City, but it feels a lot less like New York City expressly than Kalos feels like France, Alola feels like Hawaii, and Galar feels like the UK. So the Pokemon designs followed suit with this heavy-handedness, and we got a bunch of very themed Pokemon that weren't based off of Japanese lore anymore, or even plain old animals, and they instead used cultural connotations of their home regions as direct design inspirations. For example, in Generation 6 we have the Desert Fairy types and the Perfume Fairy types, both very French. In Generation 7 we have Sandy Gas being a sandcastle, and Comfey literally being a Hawaiian lei. And in Generation 8 we have Alchemy being a dessert once again, this time based off of British delicacies, and we have Stonejourner literally being Stonehenge, which is an actual physical location in Britain. A lot of these designs are great, but the downside is that it's hard to imagine certain Pokemon outside of their native regions, so their designs do become a bit limiting. So therefore, if we find one in a future game that's anywhere but Galar, it'll make little sense for that to be its natural habitat. I'm not saying that Pokemon with themed designs shouldn't be found out of their native region, because I think that's one of the greatest parts of the franchise, the connection, because some do work in other places. Like a lot of Pokemon from Alola are clearly designed to originally inhabit tropical climates, but it's easy to imagine Pokemon like Golisopod and Araquanid elsewhere, versus something like Stonejourner, because its design is a little too limiting, if that makes sense. So that's why I think Generations 3 and 4 hold up in terms of design, whereas I feel like Pokemon from Generations 6 through 8 got a little carried away with this limitation. So regardless of how good their designs are, we're going to have to factor that transportability factor into our verdict at the end. But I also want to add that all 3 of the most recent dexes had the smallest output of new Pokemon each, both due to the addition of Mega Evolution and regional forms. Because of this, I think designs were very well concentrated on all 3 dexes, and there was very little filler or inclusion of Pokemon simply based off of animals for the sake of it. You can see this in places like Alola, where there was a Pokemon like Crabrawler. Whereas Generation 1 had Krabby as a plain old crab, Crabrawler is a crab with the added touch of having a boxing motif. So that adds a lot to the latest 3 generations, because what many people regard as gimmicks actually makes for what I think is the perfect balance of believability as a creature in the ecosystem and also having some kind of fun inspiration. This can also be said of very distinct, yet very realistic designs from Generations 6 through 8, like Gogoat, Noivern, Toxtricity, and Centiskorch. So I hate to reduce the last 3 generations to the same ranking, but honestly they all have the exact same things worth praising, as well as the same things worth criticizing in my opinion. All 3 took a leap of faith and committed to entirely non-vague designs, often making very awesome Pokemon with very clear inspirations. I wouldn't say any of the Pokemon here are too vague or too boring like we got in some of the early generations, but they also suffered when these inspirations were so heavy-handed that they came off as extremely unrealistic and too limiting. So to recap everything, I think the best designs are the ones that perfectly strike the balance of believability. They could easily fit into the real world and the Pokemon world at the same time thanks to their designs. Pokemon are used to battle in-universe, and that's the staple of the franchise and the metagame. But I think people are drawn to the franchise because of the immersion, and the idea that these Pokemon might have the inherent ability to be good in battle. But first and foremost, they're equivalents to animals. They live and breathe and inhabit a complex ecosystem, each one fitting in their own unique way. I think that's the charm of the franchise, so a good design in my opinion, and a good generation, is a batch of designs that allows for striking descriptive factors of coolness, cuteness, or creepiness, while allowing for realism as a living creature. So the generations that contribute Pokemon with these qualities in a believable way will be favored. So my final verdict is Generation 3. I think that this generation, for the reason I've stated before, has the best mix of all the positive factors. I like how the franchise expanded here and it took creative risks, by having more deliberate designs that were less composite monsters to fill an RPG role, and instead honored real-world mythology in beautiful ways, creating creatures that fit into the Pokemon world in, again, a believable way, but they have design details that have a rich history and basis in our real-world cultures. They also have the right mix of shapes, colors, and variety to allow for the Pokemon to be enjoyed beyond its native region, so it avoids the vague filler problem that Generations 1, 2, and 4 had, while avoiding the over-theming that Generations 6, 7, and 8 had. For that reason, I'm going to go with Generation 3. So there you have it. That's my long-awaited pick for the best Pokemon generation. But really at the end of the day, it's dumb to argue tirelessly about which is best. Art is very, very subjective. and we all have personal biases that are impossible to overcome. Though I know that I did make a verdict by selecting a best generation, I also know that I very deliberately described each generation in a general way to get an honest overview of the design styles used there, and to point out that there's a mix everywhere, so there's good and bad everywhere. It really is impossible to hate a whole generation, because I can guarantee that in your least favorite generation, there's at least one or two that you do like, and conversely, in your favorite one, there's at least a few designs that you really don't like. So while I personally think that Generation 3 earns the title of Best Generation overall, the beauty of this franchise is that anyone can make a case for any generation to be the best in terms of designs. So no matter what, there's a ton of joy to be found in almost every design. Creating a fictional world in a video game takes a lot of work, especially when it comes to storytelling, art, programming, and marketing. So if you need help with any of these things, sometimes it's best to have a mentor. For that, you should turn to the Mentors and Moguls podcast. Heather Stone is an entrepreneur, pioneer, and founder of Mentors and Moguls. With over 28 years of experience as an entrepreneur in the fields of asset management, tech, and finance, she's no stranger to achieving goals and forging a path to success. If you're interested in learning about business and practical tools you can apply in your own life, check out the Mentors and Moguls podcast on Apple and other podcast platforms. So for more information, you should check out the 2 links in the description below. Thank you once again to Mentors and Moguls for sponsoring this video. I have a full slate of projects planned for the rest of July, so I'll see you in a few days for yet another exciting video.